Welcome to the Labour Academy and welcome to our discussion on the Universities Accord. And first, I think we should pay our respects to the traditional owners of the various lands from which we are meeting, and our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We're going to have a discussion about the Universities Accord, and the three of us who'll be speaking will be Jill Blackmore, who's a retired prof from Deakin.
I'm not retired, I'm still full-time.
Oh, I didn't know. Sorry, dear.
That's all right. And I'm Jill, not Gillian.
But her expertise is in education, particularly higher education. So she's got an extraordinary knowledge of the system. Emma Dawson from Per Capita, who is our resident political person of wisdom, and we'll talk about the HEX changes, but also about the politics of it all. And I'm going to start. I'm a retired professor from Melbourne University, and I'm going to start talking about what all of this has done. So I'm going to take this off and stop sharing. And hello, everybody. To sort of really put this whole question into perspective, we need to look at what's driven the problem. And we've got what I call national embarrassments. The first one is that we rank 91st on a table of 133. So we're a very long way down the table of the Harvard University's Growth Labs Index of Economic Complexity. So we are less complex in our economy than Moldova, than all the nations in Europe, most nations in Asia, and including some in Africa. We're down there with Bangladesh and Pakistan. And what that lack of complexity means is that we've not yet started what Harvard call the traditional process of structural transformation, in which resources are reallocated from low productivity sectors, that is taking things out of the ground or speculating on land, towards high productivity sectors like electronics and machinery manufacturing. So we are not so much a banana republic, we are still a mining republic, we are still early colonial in our actual economic development. Secondly, we have the most unequal education system in the entire OECD. And where we are distinctive is that we actually subsidise inequality. So we must be unique in subsidising inequality.
We are.
Yeah, by putting money into private schools, and particularly private schools that don't need that money. However, for our universities, we actually have, and have had for a very long time, very good academics. And one of the stellar things about the Australian university system is that the quality of the academic staff is very equal across all the universities, irrespective of their perceived standing in the community, that you're going to get just as good academics at Charles Sturt as you'll get at Federation, as you'll get at Monash, as you'll get at Deakin, as you'll get at Melbourne. And these academics punch well above their weight in research internationally. So our publications, our citations, and our international partnerships and collaborations are of extremely high quality. So we're up at the top of actual academic performance in terms of our universities, and our university staff is very international, and particularly at Melbourne, we have a very high number of outstanding people who've come from Europe, who are coming from India, from China, obviously United States and the UK. And for instance, we benefited a lot from Brexit because there were some very, very bright people who got out of Britain because the big EU funding for research was going to stop. So that's the good side of the story. The bad side is that research goes nowhere within Australia, where we rank 30th in the world in terms of our innovation outputs. So we do all this great work and it has no effect on our domestic economy. Then we've got these other challenges that the poorest Australians live in the regions, or Indigenous Australians, and we've always had a class-divided society, but we've got a growing social and economic divide, which is now along education, but it's also along precariousness of income. And we have now an upcoming generation who face insecure work for the rest of their lives, even after they've had higher education and they've got no hope of home ownership unless they eventually inherit from their parents. As a nation, we face severe headwinds in climate change, demographic change, and technological change. We're going to have to be very different sorts of workers in 30 years from what we are now. So the Australian people will need to change to cope with this future, and education is the way that we change ourselves as people. Now, how did it all go wrong? What's the core problem? And as usual, the person to first blame is John Howard.
Yes.
And just to give you an example, in 1993, the University of Melbourne received around 90% of its necessary operating funding, what we could call hard funding, from the federal government. So it was getting 90% in 1993. In 2024, that is now under 30%. 70% has gone, now has to be made up in the private sector. And so that 30% is meant to, which covers teaching and core administration, is the hard funding. But since 1993, and even more so since 1975, when Gough came in and made universities a public good and made them free, universities have exploded in size and in research activity. They are much more complex institutions than they were 20, 30 years ago. And they are more internationally connected ever before, and that research has become outstanding in quality. But the overheads of that research have exploded with that explosion of activity, both in numbers of people doing research and in the complexity of the organisation to run it. But the way that research is funded comes only in competitive grants, which are specific grants for time-limited specific projects. And sometimes those grants, if they're in the medical field, cover the salaries, but at the top level of the professors are often at a lower pay than the university's EBA, and the researchers themselves have to hustle to have side hustles to make up the shortfall in their salaries. Now, I was actually officially, strangely enough, even though I'm a historian, in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, which is why I saw what was going on. And in the very big school of population health I was in, there were perhaps fewer than 5% of us at the top who had secure jobs of guaranteed funding. And overall in the faculty, which is Melbourne's big, powerful faculty, which really what drives its wealth, 80% of the staff are paid from these soft funds of grads. Most research professors are in fact entirely self-funded. That is, most professors in medicine area have to earn their money through the grants they win. And from that, they pay their researchers and their teams from the money they get competitively. Jill has been doing that in her field. I was doing that when I was working. You spend most of your time going for grants to keep people you're looking after in a job. The success rate now for grants in the medical field, the MD, NH and MRC, is 10%. So do the maths. Obviously, this source of income has no longer become reliable. So what is happening to young people who are very bright and work very hard, get a first-class honours first degree, do a PhD, publish a number of papers, get onto a research team, become a postdoc, then perhaps they get a postdoc overseas in America, they come back, they get into another research team, and the grant dies, they're finished. And at 45, they're on the scrap heap. They've got a mortgage, they've got a family, and they've got no future. And so we have no continuity or security for people in research. So a very large number of our PhD graduates are going back to other types of work, if in the medical field, They did a medical degree to start with. They're going back to medical practice. Now, the real cost of research, all the overheads, is actually having to be paid by the universities themselves. In other countries, the government pays for that. But in this country, the universities now, since the 1990s, have been having to fund all the infrastructure costs, the buildings, the equipment, the electricity, the library services, all the machinery, the laboratories, all of the massive infrastructure to sustain a very complex research enterprise has to be funded by the university, and it has no funding to do that. So it has to earn it out in the market, and that it does with international student fees. So private students from Asia, their parents are paying for our research industry in the universities. And so what we've got is a Ponzi scheme funded by uncertain and irregular income coming in, which has to be sought and got from people overseas, in which we have to sell ourselves, and we sell ourselves on our research ranking. And the corporatization of university culture that people complain about is because we've had to become a business. And we're a business because we don't have any income otherwise. And so what we have now is a Ponzi scheme. And in the school I was in, the top researchers were actually paying the university for the privilege of working at Melbourne. The university is also forced to siphon off funding it gets from government, which is meant to pay for teaching, to try and prop up all the other infrastructure and activities and so on, so that the teaching budgets are weakened by the needs of these research needs. So what does that cause? We've got a gig economy where we have to supplement permanent teachers with casual teachers and research assistants on gig money. So it's a Ponzi scheme running a gig economy. In dollars, just finally for this intro, in international student fees in 2000, that amounted to 1.6 billion. By 2019, it was 10.4 billion. That's an incredible amount of money coming into the Australian economy. Education is our second largest export. By 2021, after the pandemic, it had gone down to 8.7 billion. The share of total uni revenue went from 10% to now over to nearly a quarter is now coming from these international student fees. The money coming from help loans being pre-packed is also decreasing because people can't pay them back, because that's going to be adjusted, and Emma will talk about that. Now, therefore, the rankings of research are what the markets and the parents in China and India are watching to see where's the best place to send their kids. And they are making horrendous sacrifices to send their children to university in Australia. It's also in the hope of immigration that they're sending here. And so we're selling ourselves. They're the best. Melbourne is dreadful at this. It's very embarrassing. So what we've got is this Ponzi scheme, which with the pandemic finally collapsed. And although there's recovery, some universities are now seriously in the red, particularly those who don't have medical schools. So what this report had to do was to find ways that we now correct this imbalance in the system, and not simply by raising taxes, but by actually doing what other countries do, which is to get our whole economy, in particular our private sector, to carry its weight in terms of supporting universities and research for the quality of the economy. So we've got to ask the public sector, the private sector, to start to partner, to be spend more on its own research and development, where amount we spend now is pitifully small compared to the top countries, which are places like Japan, South Korea, China, and so on. And this is going to require more strategic planning, top policy focus, tax incentives, and organising research, and this will be the big one, under national priorities and missions. And this is where Mariana Mazzucato's thinking is important, because what she cites as a model for countries to do was the moonshot, which the government partnered with universities and private enterprise under quite strict rules about procurement and the sort of costs and profits that private enterprise could make, but the benefits to society were massive. And there's a huge increase in innovation. A whole lot of things that we take for granted actually came from the moonshot, and you wouldn't think they'd ever come to that. So we can thank that for the mobile phone. We can thank it for a huge number of medical discoveries. So there's a need now for a new government agency to set targets for raise research and development as a much higher percentage of GDP, and we need government leadership in collaboration between the private sector, unis and government. So Australia's got to start paying to be a modern economy. That's the top line. And this report is actually tackling that key problem. Some of the things they can do it by procurement by both government and private enterprise, and bypassing the private sector in services, for instance, the big consulting companies, and that they contract universities for this work instead of KPMG. They will also have to all pay, both government and private users, the full cost of research beyond base salaries and expenses. That is, it's an overhead bill. It's a very big bill. I forget how much an add-on it is, but it's in the region of 65%, I think, Jill. And it's equivalent, but it's equivalent to the private profit that KPMG would be creaming off anyway. So no longer can people get population health research, for instance, done by KPMG instead of the Melbourne School for Population Health, when all KPMG would do a literature search and a report on the literature research with no disciplinary expertise, and then charge a squillion for it. Now they're going to have to pay the universities to do that, and that we can start paying our way. They have asked for increased funding of the competitive grant schemes, both the General Australian Research Council and the NH&MRC. An increase in grants which go for more than 5 years, because the grants are too short to be able to have a proper research program conducted. We need an expansion of the very successful collaborative research centres, which have been extremely good in bringing in local business and developing products and new inventions. There's been some wonderful ones. There's a marvellous engineer at University of New South Wales, a woman who's been working out how to do green steel. These sorts of things are very effective, particularly in regional cities, that you can have these collaborative research centres. They've got them in things like high-tech food production and so on. We need an increased private sector support for higher degree research students, and to increase their stipends and to make part-time stipends tax-free. We need more dedicated infrastructure, like the National Collaboration Research Infrastructure Scheme, which funds a huge range already, and that comes directly from the Commonwealth. Support for research capacity and local partnerships for regional universities and their place in the local economy, and much more interaction with TAFE and VET, and that you have an articulated system, and Jill will talk more about this, which people can go right through from TAFE to university, but in which they're working together, and in which people might in their working life undertake a mixture of short courses and longer courses with both systems. But what I'm very pleased to see is that they've increased the support for basic research, which the previous government had no interest in. Basic research, why do you need that? We are only interested in products. We're only interested in things we can sell, but you don't get anything done without the basic research. So the commitment to basic research as the foundation of everything that universities do is fundamental. And they want a higher education future fund. Maybe Emma can explain that one better. So they need better leadership. They want an Australian Tertiary Education Commission. They need more diversity in the system. They need TAFEs to grow and to become self-accrediting. And they want a new funding model so that everybody who actually qualifies for a course is a fully supported Commonwealth place. They're going to continue HECS and HELP, but that wall needs to be adjusted because the repayments are unfair. They need the funding, and if this funding is to research infrastructure begins to flow in, this will liberate funds within the universities to be able to spend more on teaching, because if you're going to address inequality, you've got to have specialised teaching for all sorts of different needs. We've got free preparatory courses and regional study hubs, and so it's essentially trying now to take the burden that the universities are bearing themselves, which no other OECD country does, of having to fund everything, which is all their research infrastructure, to be able to concentrate their funding on teaching and so on. So this is a very bold plan. It's the only way that we will survive the future. And no doubt the purse clutchers will be clutching their purses. So on that point, I will hand over to Jill.
Oh, okay, right. Thank you. All right. Yes, well, it's very hard to follow from that, I have to say, because you've covered some of my ground as well. But yes, I think the thing about the report that really impresses me the most is that it uses the notions, it's very aspirational, it's very ambitious, but it actually brings together issues around equity and innovation. And my task is to talk mainly around the equity implications of the report and the recommendations related to that. What is really commendable about it is that the whole aim is to double participation in the vet sector, the whole tertiary education sector, which is the TAFE, the vets and the university sector, to boost it from 60 to 80%. And this is to be achieved by 2050. And the aim also is to have at least 55% of all 25 to 34-year-olds in university qualified. And this aligns very much with the notion of the necessity to upskill the nation to address the types of needs of the knowledge economy and to build a skilled workforce. And so that's the first major issue. It's an issue that, of course, raises issues around that has always been pointed to by Janet, around the fact that it will require significant rebuilding of the academic workforce and expansion of the academic workforce to undertake that type of job. And we lost a large number of very young and skilled academics due to a lot of the activities that went on during the COVID experience, when many vice-chancellors took it upon themselves to restructure and to get rid of many staff. The second thing that is absolutely important is its focus on rural, regional, Indigenous and low socioeconomic students. And there's a large section which focuses on the role of regional universities and the desire to make them more central than they already are to regional economic and cultural development. And also to recognise that these same groups of students also often are located in the outer suburbs of the larger cities, and that these are also where low socioeconomic development is happening or occurring. In recognising this, they are also recognising that rural and regional universities have significant and important research that is done, but they have much less income to undertake and build the same type of infrastructure that Janet's referred to. In other words, they've got to run expensive campuses, they've got to provide a range of supports, and yet they have 25% of most of the low SES students compared to, say, the city-based universities, which have about 10%, and some of the G of 8 have even fewer low SES students than that. So one of the main focuses of this is to address this group of universities and particularly these students. So it's very much a focus on what is called demand-driven for equity. Now, the Bradley review is just demand-driven, like let all people come, and basically the low SES students didn't come, and and others did. And so basically now the focus is, this is about equity groups to be encouraged for them to come. They are students who should therefore be offered Commonwealth funded places to all of these groups, which is already occurring for the Indigenous students, both in the city and in rural areas, but they are suggesting that those places should be also now freed up for all of the equity groups. There's also a focus on what they call needs-based funding. Now, this is based on the model of how schools are funded or not funded, if it's public schools, and that you have a base funding according to per capita. And then in addition to that, there's an equity index that is calculated according to the diversity and particular aspects of the student body you have in a particular school. And that is an add-on fund, it's an equity fund that you can then utilise in any particular way. So they're arguing that that should be a similar type of funding, but particularly focusing on that type of funding for the rural and regional universities to make up for the types of work that they're undertaking for that particular group of students. But at the same time, the report recognises that issues of retention is that really you can't expand the number of students already in higher education unless you improve the retention rate in secondary schooling. And we know that already in secondary schooling that fewer students are taking up the ATAR score and that there's a higher rate of non-completion of year 12. And this is a major issue for us. And actually one of the preconditions I would argue is that you have to improve the funding to public schooling and at least get the Gonski funding as it should, recommendations implemented fully. And I would argue to be more radical, to make those who want to go to alternative schools to pay for their own, for their choice. But anyway, so the issue around retention is that they're arguing that there needs to be focused on alternative ways of accessing higher education, and that regional and public schools have fewer options in terms of allowing their students to be readily prepared for university, and therefore there needs to be additional support to build their academic skills and career advice to broaden on those career aspirations. And I certainly know in my own research around career aspirations is around that kids are geographically bounded on the way they think about their future careers according to their local community in place in which they go to school, where they live and with their parents. And it is about developing those career aspirations and to not only just develop those career aspirations, but to provide support and to develop better articulation and closer arrangements for them to access and transition into higher education by providing a range of types of additional supports for them at that particular time. They are also arguing in the basis of equity that there should be better articulation for those students that do not necessarily want to go into higher education to go into vet and the TAFE sector, but that there should be a type of lifelong learning experience in which students and individuals can come in and out of work and university or TAFE or tertiary education at any time throughout their careers. In other words, greater flexibility. And this would require things like perhaps micro-credentials, the developing of shorter courses and things to upskill people as they go throughout their career. It also, they suggested that the universities could actually undertake a whole lot of additional supports for students who are in greatest need, and the equity groups in particular. Some examples they refer to are improving outreach out to the schools, to address welfare issues, to establish a student ombudsman, and this is particularly around the case of sexual harassment issues, which have been largely not addressed by the universities in any meaningful way. They talk about a national student charter and establishing, once on graduation, job brokers to facilitate the transition out of graduation and into employment. But there's not much use having those types of supports in the university sector unless they also have enabling programs to transition students into universities. So there's a discussion and recommendation around having fee-free enabling programs where students can access these programs, and they already exist, but to increase these, to add to the ways in which students can upskill themselves into type of academic literacies and study skills that they require. Janet's already mentioned the indexation of help and how that would should be at the lowest rate and not at the current CPI industry rates. A major issue, again, focusing on the rural and regional, is the notion of doubling the number of study hubs, which already exist already. There's been various reports showing and evaluating how these are particularly helpful for students in the regions. They're places where they can go for support, and also that these should be doubled and extended in the outer suburbs and the cities. Again, the focus on students, equity students. Of importance for those of us in education and nursing and welfare, and those having to do clinical supervision, certainly one of the impacts of the Job Ready graduates policy that was introduced, which is now going to be abolished, is that the education nursing students, welfare students on their practicums, which are mandated, should be paid for those practicums. At the moment, many students drop out because they cannot leave the jobs that they need, that they're in, because they have to earn an income in order to stay in university, and they cannot just get up and go to a placement in another place or another city or a town, whatever, in order to go to those placements. So payment of those placements would be absolutely critical. We know already we have key issues and problems around shortages of both teachers and also nurses at the same time. The other key issue around governance is the commission has been appointed with 4 commissioners, and one of those commissioners is again focusing on equity, and that equity commissioner would be very much trying to bring both equity issues right across the range of policy activities that particular commissioner's role is. And the role of that commission is huge. It's like, it's about developing higher education research, it's about planning, it's about the mission compacts, it's about pricing of courses, funding allocations, accountability, transparency, data collection, etc. So again, the issue that equity needs to be really maintained throughout all of those key roles that commission is meant to be undertaking. The Future Fund, of course, I won't mention that because I think Emma's going to talk about that. But on the other issue around equity, the issue of sexual harassment, which the universities have not dealt with at all well since the initial report back in 2017, that is now going to be addressed through a variety of mechanisms as well. What is not mentioned in general, though, other than mentioning of that there is a need for better governance and good governance, and they cite the whole issues of casualisation, underpay, the outrageous Vice-Chancellor salaries, is around the fact that that there is a need to change the nature of the councils, to have greater representation and diversity of students and academic staff in that particular thing, because that is where the idea of what a university is needs to be start with the councils, which are currently filled with people who come from a business background and have little knowledge about the actual, what it is to be in the university, to have any experience of the university. So these are some of the key equity issues. All I would argue is that all of these are fantastic policies as they stand, but of course, how much of it will be actioned, it will be of great interest. And we know that any higher education policy cannot be treated as distinct from other policies around migration, around visa policies, around workforce planning, and all of that is all occurring at the same time. And that there is a need to build research capacity, certainly, as well as teaching capacity of the academic workforce. That is definitely a key issue that needs to be addressed. So I'll just finish on that point.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. Now, Emma, we've got to get you through fast because you've got a 10-year-old waiting.
Okay. She's happily watching some chicken run movie in the other room, so I'm sure she'll...
You won't tell anyone.
Thanks for inviting me, and good to be with you. And I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Bunurong people and pay my respects to elders past and present. So this a University Accord report is quite a thrilling read for those of us that have bothered to really get to grips with it. But I think what we also need to acknowledge is while the committee and Mary have done a fantastic job, they were also empowered by quite a bold terms of reference, quite a bold scope in the first place. And as I said to Janet earlier today, governments don't tend to do big, bold, far-reaching reports if they don't recognise that things are broken and need fixing. They tend to try to quarantine and contain the advice that they get if they don't have an intention of doing something about it. So being an optimist, I will take that as my first good sign. The second good sign is we've got a very capable minister in the education portfolio who really has devoted his life to educational equity and to providing opportunities for young people from less advantaged backgrounds. And so I think we can trust that Jason Clare will do his utmost to drive these reforms through. It's not going to be an easy process, and it's certainly not going to be a quick one. Because what we are seeing, of course, as we're seeing in a lot of, as we know, is happening in a lot of different areas of government policy, is the fact that we're now tackling years of not only neglect but hostility towards research and towards tertiary education. One of the other heartening things is that the government has, I think, quite cleverly framed this report as being essential to our future, essential to the productivity of our economy, but essential to embracing the opportunities that come with the transition to a post-carbon economy, recognising that the best investment governments can make is in people and is in the education of their people, and trying to frame this within its broader which the rhetoric of this government's not terribly soaring, but if you look at what they're trying to do, they're framing this within, as Janet said, a broader approach to real economic reform for the future, and to making an investment now that will have dividends in an ongoing way. So to some of the elements that will need to be supported by academics, by researchers, by the university community, but by the broader public as well, if they're going to get traction for change. The obvious focus, one of the obvious focuses in this Accord report is a focus on equity and access to university. So talking about those people, those Australians that have not traditionally had access to a higher education, and despite the reforms of the Howard and Keating years, and the opening up of university places and the lifting of caps under Gillard, everything we've tried has still resulted in some groups being marginalised. And even when they do access tertiary education, there's very unequal outcomes in terms of what that access is. So really looking at First Nations people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, first attenders, first in family to go to uni as a focus of this report, migrants and refugees, and people from regional and rural areas. But importantly, this report doesn't just pay lip service to that. It actually suggests some quite innovative ways of making access better. So the Higher Education Future Fund idea, might work because the Group of 8 came out against it, immediately panicking that they might be required to give some of the, steaming piles of revenue they have made due to their well-located sandstone inner city campuses attracting the bulk of high-paying students. To actually support the sector as a whole. So the way that fund would work would be a contribution by those very wealthy universities to be matched by government until it reaches $10 billion, and then invested in a kind of, they're really sovereign wealth funds, future funds, that will mean that the returns can then be invested into supporting smaller universities, into supporting the infrastructure that those regional universities desperately need, new libraries, new communications infrastructure, facilities on campus that will allow them not only to offer better experiences and services to their existing student base, but then perhaps also to attract some of those international students in future as well. It is a very effective measure for equity, and one I think is likely to get up. They've also, I think, taken a very sensible approach to the issue of HECS, or HELP, Higher Education Loan Program as it's known now, Higher Education Contribution Scheme as it was when first introduced. I was in the very first cohort of undergraduate students. I started my university life in 1990, and HECS came in 1989. When it was first introduced, HECS worked very well for me. I graduated with a debt of around $15,000, which, you know, in real terms would be about 40,000 today. But because of the way that that debt was indexed and the repayment requirements, it did not have the kind of impact on my life that those debts are having for young people today. Not only are they generally higher, the debts that they're coming out with, particularly in professional fields, but they're being required to pay them back at a much lower rate of income than I certainly was. The idea behind HECS originally was that it would allow us to expand access to university, but saying to young people, you'll only repay your portion of this cost if you see a real income benefit from your higher education. So only once you were on the kind of salary that came because you had attained a degree would you start contributing to the cost of that. We're now asking people with you know, $40,000, $50,000 debts, with bachelor degrees in law, in science, in arts, to start paying them back, paying back the cost of these loans when they're still working in retail and hospitality. So that social contract has been completely broken. So the Accord made some recommendations around retying the value of the degree to the price of HECS, to the cost of the degree, to changing the indexing so that it's the lower of whatever inflation and wage growth is, so that people aren't behind all the time. And critically, one of the things that probably shocks people, calculating your repayment for the year based on your debt after you've made repayments, not as it was 12 months ago. So this will actually reduce a lot of the, take a lot of the heat out of the issue of student debt in Australia. I think it's really important to remember that HECS, as it was originally conceived, was quite an equitable measure, and it worked well. It's nothing like the student debt problems that they have in the States, where people are genuinely taking out loans from private organisations that they pay interest on, and they're crippling over a lifetime. We can fix HECS so that it's an access and equity measure. I liked that Jill talked about paid placements. This is something we've done some work on at Per Capita. I'm going up next week to Canberra with the Australian Services Union and the Students Against Placement Poverty and social work educators to present our work on the impact of those unpaid placements on particularly feminised industries. We don't expect apprentice electricians or plumbers or engineers or construction workers to do their apprenticeship without pay. And yet we do expect nurses and teachers and social workers and women in the care sector to do 1,000 hours in some cases. The social work requirements are 1,000 hours for free. That's effectively, and it's a big contributing factor to the outcomes that we see, where we've got completion rates in some of those degrees of 50 to 55%.
In education.
Right, simply because often the people that are attracted to those jobs want to give back to their community. Often they're women, they're predominantly women, particularly in social work. As well, they're often women from low socioeconomic backgrounds or marginalised communities who have an understanding of the work, but they simply can't afford not to have an income for 1,000 hours while they complete those courses. And so the Minister has made some very positive noises in that direction. I think we can expect to see some movement toward paid placements over time. And how we will implement that, it remains to be seen, but it's really critical that we ensure that students, really promising students, aren't discouraged or aren't forced to drop out of their studies simply because they can't fulfil that professional practice requirement. It's robbing us of a lot of talented people. And then to the research agenda, I think one of the big challenges here is how, as Janet talked about, and I won't go over that ground, but that we really fund research badly in this country. We've allowed universities to carry the load for that, therefore to have to over-rely on income from international students, and then cut services. So we fall into a trap of exploiting students effectively just to fund what is an inadequate research budget. The biggest challenge in this country, actually, compared to the most innovative nations that Janet mentioned earlier, is the lack of involvement of our corporate sector in this regard. And so businesses in Australia do very, very nicely digging up our resources and selling them off overseas, and they don't reinvest into our country. We will need to see all sectors working together if we're going to embrace the opportunities of becoming a renewable energy superpower, of embracing the post-carbon economy, building the next economy, and creating those jobs and those opportunities that are going to be needed for our young people, but are also going to allow them to fulfill their potential and to fulfill their ambitions. And so what's really important there, I think, is to challenge the business sector to say, well, if you're not going to invest in research and development, in innovation, in broadening and expanding the diversity of our economy and our industrial base, we'll make you. There are ways of doing this, and one I suggested to Janet earlier today is to say, well, if you don't, for example, put 1.52% of your profits back into research and development and innovation, we'll tax you, we'll put a levy on you, and we'll create a fund that will then go to fund research in our university sector and to find a way of ensuring that that research is able to be transformed into applied outcomes and innovation. There's a lot of really innovative thinking in this Accord report. It's a very bold in scope, it's broad in ambition, but it is also really practical. It doesn't do that thing that a lot of independent reports do, where they say, well, if we were starting with a white piece of paper, or that old thing, well, if you were going to get to the pub, I wouldn't start from here. They look at where we are starting from, and they make recommendations for how we can reclaim what was once one of the world's, most promising and innovative higher education sectors. We have, as Janet and Jill have both said, some of the most passionate, dedicated, really clever people in the world in this country, and far too many of them go overseas because they're not given the opportunity to complete their career here and to contribute the things that we need them to as a nation. Before I finish, I'll say this is we are now really in the last year of the first term of an Albanese Labor government. I, unlike others, don't really think there'll be an election before about this time in 12 months. I think it's highly unlikely that the coalition will be able to form government after the last election, but we face the very real prospect of a minority government. We needn't be afraid of that, and particularly given the makeup of the crossbench. We have very highly educated women in the seats in the lower house that were formerly Liberal seats, the Teals, as you might want to call them. We have a mixed bag in the Senate, but some very thoughtful people. David Pocock's a very thoughtful and engaged crossbencher. Even some of the Greens, Barbara Pocock certainly comes from a background where she appreciates and understands these things. So even if Labor doesn't win a majority at the next election, I am not pessimistic about the opportunity for universities and tertiary education reform. What we have here, though, is a big challenge and a big blueprint. It's not all going to be done at once, but I think the direction of the report is very clear. It's about opening up our universities to embrace all of the talented people that could benefit from a university education. It's about aligning the goals of our universities with where we want to be as a country, but also where we need to be on an economic footing, and about really building in some equity to the system itself, so that there's less inequity between the institutions of higher learning, and as also really critically importantly looks at building those links between university education and skills training, and recognising that these things need to go hand in hand, and those old silos between vocational and pure education have really broken down in most people's minds. That's not that I would never say don't do an arts or pure science degree for the sake of it, because I did one myself and they're incredibly useful, but recognising that we now have around 53% of young people with a tertiary degree. We want to get to 80%. That's very different than where we were when free tertiary education was introduced 50 years ago, when only around 14 to 15% of young people were going to university. So we won't turn the clock back, and nor should we. But what we should be doing is building an educational system that embraces and gives people opportunities throughout their life to really achieve their full potential, because we know that the best investment we can make collectively is in the intellectual and productive capacity of our people, and education is the way to do that. So I'm optimistic.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, Jill. We're going to open it up for questions, particularly since Emma has to leave a little earlier. So abandon your inhibitions and shyness. Come forward, please, and speak what your hopes are for the sector, and whether you're pleased, I think, by the news that, in a sense, I don't think the media has been giving you. So the intention of this session was to open up what the potential of this report is. So have we got anybody who's game enough to start?
Me?
Yes, Sue Pavlovich.
Hi, I teach in a high school in Horsham, and we have a large group of, it's the biggest regional high school around. It performs okay, but will students who want to go in a low socioeconomic, and this is far out of the city, will this funding allow them to have a better go at getting a university of choice, or will they be limited to the local federation uni, which has atrophied courses over the years? You know, it has. Do you know if there's portability of funding for those marginalised groups, or will it be going to universities?
I think perhaps Jill can answer this better than any of us.
It won't, I don't think, as far as I read it, won't go specifically to the students. It's not a voucher system, which is what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Where you're given a voucher and you can go wherever you like. I think the argument here is, and I think you have to, and I probably wouldn't totally agree about federation, but anyway, the issue is at the moment, and they recognise this, is that the regional universities are underfunded. They can't offer the same comprehensive courses that they can in other places, and they're actually wanting to improve that. But also they're trying to argue the case around the fact that the students themselves and the schools actually need more supports to enable students to think about their careers and opportunities, and that all universities should, the ATAR score itself is becoming less and less used. I think only about 25% of students go into university. The ATAR score, as far as I'm concerned, should be abolished completely. Universities should take on responsibility for selecting their own students in another way. But the Accord report argues that those that there needs to be another way and ways in which these students can access any of the universities of their choice. And so there's no reason in which why they can't access any university of their choice anyway, even currently now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there is a commitment in the report to increased funding for accommodation of students.
Oh, the accommodation bit.
So
Yes,
this would be critical for regional students.
This is absolutely where our guys get absolutely stuck and hammered.
Once they get into Yep.
Except that the country when I was teaching, our best students came from country high
Yes,
schools.
I know.
I'm
We
serious.
work very hard on our students,
I know.
but we have a very broad range of children
Yeah,
and a
yes.
very broad range. Yes, but no, there is a broad range. But thank you.
Well, they know how to work.
Well,
They
we know that the public school
self-
kids actually
self-reliant.
know how to get, and they actually stay in if they can afford to, and if you know we know they are good once they get in there. Yes.
Yeah.
Come on, is anyone else who's got? I know there's a few education people in the audience. Jamie, have you got a thought? No, he hasn't got a thought. So, I just think one of the issues that we've got where the system's failing us is in that there are a couple of key areas which appear to be high income and posh and all those things, but where we're not delivering. Melbourne University Dental School has 90 spots, only 30 of those are funded for students. Everybody else has to pay fees. And the debts they end up with are up towards 200,000, as are the medical students. Plus, now that we're going to graduate medical courses, people have to self-fund their way through graduate school. They don't get a support income. This means that the medical and professions are being squeezed back down to being elite professions. And we need more dentists in the country. We need more dentists who are prepared to work in Broadmeadows. And we don't get them this way. So this is one of the really perverse effects of the fee-based thing, that those that could charge high fees, and likewise with law, they're now coming out with debts in the region of near 200,000. The effects in medicine and dentistry is that new graduates are forced to go and work for corporate practices, usually overseas loaned, and indulge in extremely bad medicine. So, these are the sort of bad effects that not only they just can't afford to go into private practice, and the number of students willing to go into private practice is getting smaller and smaller, into general practice, I'm sorry. And, they see it as downgraded. It's just tears and smears. And everyone's going to become a specialist, and there's a shortage of work for specialists. I know it's horrible, isn't it? Anyone who would say that, I'd put them out of medical school. It has very perverse effects even on the professions. Jamie,
And they do mention in reference the case studies of the regional medical schools, and the ways in that they develop those in order to try and keep people from the regions and staying in the regions. But
that's right, they're very important, and
they're
also
very important,
providing full scholarships for people who are prepared to stay in the regions.
Yes.
And
thank you very much. Great presentations. Can I ask what the thinking is about migrant and visa holders who are at the moment largely precluded from tertiary education?
Which group excluded?
People on bridging visas, or people seeking asylum, or those groups can't afford to self-fund.
I think that in Victoria they can go to TAFE.
Yes.
Some TAFEs.
They can go to TAFE. To get a Commonwealth supported place, you'd have to have a student visa.
Yes.
And if you've got a student, you actually have to pay international fees. You can't get a Commonwealth supported place unless you've got a permanent residence, I think, and even be a citizen. It could be that bad.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
It's a permanent residence.
It's PR. You have to have PR. Yeah.
Okay.
Jamie.
I'll take up your urging me to ask a question, and I realise there is one. In the report, how does it deal with the before tertiary issues around schools and I know that I've heard a couple of remarks about the already that there's a that they should do away with some of the school issues. But the critical thing is that, well, there are two things about schools which concern me, and I don't know whether they're covered or could be covered in this report. One is the obvious equity issue of the fact that public schools are underfunded and non-public schools are gravely overfunded. And you know, I'd be embarrassed to let anyone know what school I went to because it was so more expensive than and better organised. So that's one of the issues. But the other issue is the question of discrimination and the harm done to students by the prejudices inherent in religious-based schools.
Oh, yes.
I know it's just hit the newspapers at the moment, the media at the moment, that there may be some problems with getting through the promised improvements to the equal opportunity law. But equal opportunity law is only one part. Education should not be hobbled in schools in a way that prevents good young people from actually getting to the possibility of tertiary education. I'm not sure whether this is covered at all in the report, but it needs to be dealt with in some stages.
Jill?
Right. Oh, you can try it too, Emma, if you want. You do finance.
Emma,
Okay. Well, under the Gonski deal of no school being penalised by trying to fix up the funding mess that Howard created, we currently, as you said, have the public schools being underfunded of 95%, and the most of the non-government schools achieving 104% of what they should be getting. I mean, I can't see, and this is where the whole religious question comes into it. What's happened under Howard was that schools, because of the ways in which the funding, people followed the funding and the school choice types of debates, is that large numbers of parents have moved from the public sector to the private sector. And by the way, that they take out money from the public sector as they move into the private sector to do that. So what has happened is that we've had a huge expansion of this in the independent, so-called independent sector, which is not independent, of very small faith-based schools. So now we don't just have the lobby of the Catholic education lobby, which is very powerful, and the independent school lobby. We now have all the other faiths also wanting to have Islamic schools, a whole variety of other religious schools. So religion is becoming more and more significant in our secular society than ever before.
I'm just still listening.
Oh, right.
No, it's really.
So therefore, the
It's
issue.
fantastic.
Thanks very much. I'm glad it's terrific. So the issue here is that the religious issue is becoming more and more pertinent around the funding issue, and it always has been. But I think it's got worse now, Nelly, because I can't see any political party really resolving those basic problems. I'm just terribly concerned about that. But I think we can speed up they're now currently renegotiating under the Better Schools deal between the federal government and the states about getting the Gonski expectations up to doing it faster and doing it better. But the states are arguing about who's going to pay the 5%, and the Commonwealth doesn't want to pay the extra 5%, and so that's where the debates are. But I do think the religious issue is now, it's going to be even harder to shift now because there's more lobby groups around the religious issue and their capacity to discriminate, which I find absolutely obnoxious that I pay for people to discriminate. It's absolutely against my, that they have a capacity to do that. So I don't know if other people have another perspective.
Luke Cherry's had his hand up. I can't see him, but Luke, do you want to come in now?
Hi, yeah, I don't have my video on because I'm
chilling in the nice quiet bedroom at the moment. So
all right. Okay. We don't want to see your bedroom. It's all
no,
right.
that's okay. And thanks for that. It was really, oh God, hang on. Sorry, I'm also on a mobile phone that's now playing up on me. You guys
Yeah.
can hear me all right there, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that. I think it was really good. And lowered hand. Just the questions that go on from what Jamie was saying, but on a slightly different angle. So just so you guys know, so I'm a teacher up at Mount Ridley College in Craigieburn. So I deal there's a lot of religion in the school from different backgrounds, but setting that aside, we also estimate we have about a 75 to 80% trauma rate amongst our students and things like this, right? I'm teaching year 12 to these kids, studies to these kids. Some of the most, incredible kids that have overcome so much in their life and are able to try and keep themselves on track, but such a low percentage of any chance of getting into most of the universities that we have. I'd put these kids up against the best Geelong Grammar could mount when it came to running an argument or, kind of overcoming obstacles and being resilient in their life. But, when it comes to the tests that we have to provide them, the standardized system of entry that they have to approach that is tailored to people so far removed from them, they're never going to get to uni. And if they did, I don't know, maybe they'd do okay. But I'm interested. I don't know much about if the report or anything looks at the entry system into these universities, because I agree, like it's great to be offering more versatile courses and trying to open up how we assess kids at uni or students at uni. But when we're still using the same very, very tired and outdated system of assessing whether or not they should be able to go into uni, that really discriminates against these kids, not even on religious grounds, but the old saying about if you test a fish on how well it can climb a tree, So I'm just, not sure if it covers that side of things.
They have, Luke. I think Jill will speak to this, but there's a very strong emphasis on trying to provide a bridge for people who've missed out at school and had a lot of personal handicaps and social handicaps. So Jill, no, they're really taking this on board. This is a passion of the minister. So Jill, please.
Yeah, they've recognised that the ATAR score which is what you're talking about, where you're just given virtually one number to complete 13 years of schooling. Again, something absolutely unique to Australia and not elsewhere. That is losing its value anyway, because a lot of people don't access universities that way. So they're arguing the case that there has to be multiple ways of students getting into university, where the universities take more responsibility of actually looking at what the student is capable of, perhaps more teacher assessment, taking into account. We've done it before. We had what was called the Secondary Tertiary Entrance Certificate way back, the STC, in my days when I was teaching. And it actually worked very well, and universities were very aware of that. And during COVID, actually, it happened, would you believe? And actually, I had the hope at that moment of COVID that the ATAR score would disappear. But the universities are very lazy about this, and they do have to, it does cost a bit more to go through alternative pathways, but they're also arguing that there should be what I call enabling courses, where kids' academic literacy, their capacity to undertake the type of work that you do when you go to a university, they're suggesting they should be established and expanded. They're talking about improvement of skills development and other things. So they're very conscious in this report of that issue that you've spoken about. And we know that when the public school kids get into university, because they haven't been spoon-fed, they actually do very well. And actually, so I'm a public school kid who went to Melbourne Uni in the 1960s, and one of very few. And basically we know that they have the resilience because they've had to really be more independent as learners, as opposed to kids have been coached to get the ATAR, And so I totally agree with what you're saying. They've absolutely got the ability, but it's how do we construct or make that capability and develop it so that they both have the aspiration to do it, but also the capacity and the pathways to do it. I think they're the three key things.
Yeah, I think we should also say that with a much more diverse system, there'll be other pathways into university. And as we all know, the friends and people and students we've had who've come indirectly into university via TAFE quite often.
Definitely.
That's really important, particularly for boys, because they often mature late and they become discouraged. And so one of the benefits everyone talks about Whitlam's reforms giving all these women a second chance, but there are a hell of a lot of working class men who got a second chance with free education.
That's right.
So the ability to have a much more nuanced way of getting into uni, and that's where having articulation from TAFE right through to university, as
It's so important.
RMIT and Victoria universities now do, terribly important, because we're losing, and we're particularly losing boys. Now everyone's been going on about we've got to get girls up and girls' education. The universities are dripping with girls,
Well, 55, 53%.
and you know, some faculties are now almost entirely female, like veterinary science. Arts faculty is overwhelmingly female. Very serious if you don't have any boys studying history and literature. That's a very serious thing for your teaching profession and for society. So we've got to have a much more flexible system. And yes, unquestionably, at Melbourne University, I used to actually do surveys of my students, and I reckon that an expensive private school put an artificial 5 to 7 points on your ATAR score. That was the value you got for all those fees, and then they crash when they get to uni.
I was on the Victorian Curriculum Assessment Authority, and I would watch that most of the people who put in for special consideration were from the private schools and non-independent schools, because they had all the staff that were dedicated to putting in special consideration. I mean, it was astonishing. I was so outraged by this, you know, practice. I'm just saying, we are here. The BCAA is here helping privilege and advantage be mobilised, you know. Anyway.
Now, someone else, Leah, you've got something.
Yes, thank you, Janet. I was trying to make us reflect on the fact that we don't really define education at the secondary or at the tertiary level. And that's a big oversight, because we really don't know as a taxpayer what we're providing. And it's one of the most vulnerable forms of consumptions, because with a vacuum cleaner, you can describe what you want it to do at the end. With a degree, that is infinitely harder. Also, the real job readiness and research readiness and a lot of other core skills and knowledge areas are not being described in any legislative form, in which case what we get at the end is a very varied outcome. And we don't really have any form as a student to actually really drill down into the detail of what the degree delivers.
Oh, that's a
point. Thank you. Yeah.
I find it. Okay. As someone who's watched these mechanisms of measuring and accountability and defining outcomes in both school education and in higher education, I worry that we define everything too closely. We are here to educate the whole person rather than develop them as a set of skills or competencies. I think that's a big issue around that.
I'm not arguing against educating people, quite the opposite.
I know, but I'm just saying, I just felt that, anyway, no.
I wasn't saying evaluation isn't a good thing or metrics isn't a good thing, or that there can't be adverse outcomes when we do measure and when we do evaluate. The question is really, if you're not actually able to define what you're delivering, you have no way of actually making the consumption of education something that is transparent and accountable. And I think that's a big problem.
Emma.
I'd love to grapple with that. I'm actually going to have to leave because it's just my daughter's bedtime. She's been in 3 times to ask me to come. I do understand what you're saying, Leah. I think that, you know, the intrinsic value of education is something we must always defend. And we must never fall into the trap of making transactional arguments about the value of education. But I do think that this entire process has been framed very clearly around the fact that what we need is to not only provide new skills to people for the new economy, but to develop those critical thinking skills that are the absolute foundation of university and of tertiary education. That ability to think creatively, to think to think innovatively and to be able to adapt over the life course to changing demands and changing professions. I think, yes, we now live in a world where we need to say, well, if this is costing X, then the return is Y. But I think more broadly, most people understand, and if they don't understand, they accept that education is by far the best investment, that universities, and if this accord process and the recommendations are adopted, then a lot of that siloed thinking around TAFE over here, there's registered training organisations over there, there's tertiary group of 8 universities, there's regional universities, a lot of that will be broken down, and people will, what the Accord and what Mary and the panel have tried to do is frame investment in higher education as fundamental, not only to individual needs, but as to our
public good
needs as a country.
Well, thank you, Emma, very much, and say apologies to Iris, and we'll release you to your maternal duties.
Thank you.
Look, we've
Thanks,
got
Emma.
Karen you've got something you want to say. Bye, Emma.
Oh,
Thank
Bye,
you.
Emma.
just a quick question, and it may not fit under this accord, but has there been any talk of redressing the differences in HECS for science, humanities and arts and STEM?
Yeah, that's going to be abolished. Yeah, they're fixing all of that. It was ridiculous. It didn't work. It was a disaster.
Any timeline on that?
I think it's going to be soon. Yeah.
I think it's going to be that's going to be one of the first things, I think, yeah.
Yeah. Now, that was such a nonsense. It was a complete failure.
Well, we found in education, we got less money and more students. So, and the same thing happened in science. So it didn't work at all because we ended up, having to do more with less so it impacted on quality as well as other things, yes.
Mm.
So, Sue, if you've got more to add, you've been, you need to switch on.
When you were talking about putting schools in a religious framework for other schools other than public schools, another way of framing it is schools which have access to charity status and being able to raise funds through taxation perks for people who can park their money, or philanthropically funded,
That's right.
if that's the way. So I was just changing it that if you can define a charity status, then you can appropriate the money. And I think that also comes to some universities. And then the other complexity that comes in, that's just recently come in, is that depending on what your business is turning over, there's a different sense of accountability for your money for audit purposes. So they are just another framework to think about schools as an industry, or certain schools, charities as industries. And schools
It's a
as
very good
industries.
point. I always joke to the city of Burndower, which has got 15 of the top elite public schools. If you go up Barker's Road, and I said one day, do the people in the city of Burndower realise that they don't pay payroll tax to the state government, they don't pay rates, and they don't pay land tax?
Correct.
And yet we can't, and we pay them money, we give them money from the public, and yet we can't enter on their grounds and use their sports facilities. I think
exactly
totally that,
and so what we're saying is that's an inequitable charitable system in a sense, because a public school can't raise funds in the same manner. Therefore, my parent should, if it was equitable, could pay their $250 amount to us. We would write them a receipt and they could claim it as a donation to us.
Exactly.
Good point. I think that could be something we could put to conference.
We could put that up. I think that's a very good idea. Yeah.
It is a really good idea.
Anybody here, who's a delegate? I'm a conference delegate. Anyone else?
No.
No. All right. Well, Sue, I'll connect with you.
We will chat.
Yeah, we will chat. Do you know Eric Dearicott?
Who?
Eric Dearicott. No, you don't. He sort of runs our group. Former deputy principal of Kyneton High School, so he understands. He'll help. We'll keep in touch.
Chat.
Jason.
Yeah, look, I have a question. I haven't read the report line by line, so the answer might be there. And I'll say I work at Federation University, not in an academic capacity. And I say that because it's about regional universities and the talk about funding for education in the regions. And I'm just trying to work out whether this is only about funding regional universities or whether there's anything about the bigger universities, the city universities providing university campuses in regional areas.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're talking, one of the suggestions, one of the ideas they're floating is a national regional university.
That's not going to get up.
No, I don't pity, but there's certainly there can be more sharing. But federation is a particular thing that makes me very cross because I think it's such an important university, and I'm very cross that they've had to kill off their humanities.
Yes.
You know, I mean, one of the things I would hope to see is people being able to go back to university in later life. As an historian, I know that people become interested in history as they age, and it's often a lost cause trying to teach young people history, but older people are fascinated. So if we want to keep the profession going, and in Ballarat, you've got an enormous local history community, all of the stuff that was coming out of Federation just in my own discipline was terribly important and a source of great pleasure and fulfillment to people.
But I think this is part of a wider trend in the attack on the humanities and social sciences across the whole sector, that it has been reducing over a long period of time as the focus is increasingly on STEM. So I think it's a wider issue, but it's been pretty detrimental in damaging both the Australian Catholic University as well as Federation. And just astonishing, really, that they think it's okay for a university. I mean, what is a university? You have to ask that question.
But I don't know why they persecute ACU. I mean, the great crime is that we've been teaching cultural Marxism, apparently.
Well, thank God.
Really? Yes, sir.
If only.
If only, yeah. So, sorry, you're muted.
About your equity groups and the dismantling of equity, Gippsland campus of Federation Uni used to be Monash. Monash,
yes.
Said goodbye to it, and then it had a very good Indigenous specific course, absolutely on the money, with people going through masters. Really, really good. I was studying my master's at the same time there. So, and then it got switched off at the time after the number of years came by where the funding left. Fed Uni said, bye-bye. And that was it. So the next place people from that area had to go would be Ballarat, off country, impossible to do because it's no longer on country. And then the same thing's happened in Horsham.
That's right.
I have archived the art department on the main street. If you like a printing press, 2 of them, many easels, many things. I belong to an arts organisation that went, yes, if you're going to put it all in the skip, we'll have it. And they put engineering, and that was just last year. And so the Indigenous course isn't run from there. And now we're talking about equity to claw all those things back. I mean, that'd be nice, but, you know, it's just had the knife to it, and it's nice that they're doing this now, but who's going to trust it out of the communities that it's not going to go?
Yeah. Once you've been decimated.
Trust in Gippsland's zhunked, and that beautiful art department is on the skids now. They've taught it out, and Horsham got taught out 8 years ago. And so, and then that's all I'm saying.
Yes, I know.
I mean, I don't know what's happening. Sue might know something about nursing training, nursing education, which is...
You can do your simple stuff in Horsham, but if you want to be a little bit more and want to go to specialisation, you need to go to Melbourne or somewhere else. Not available locally. I was talking... I was discussing that with a parent and a child in parent-teacher interviews today about her pathway.
Okay.
and about her aspirations. And she was really chuffed that she might be able to get not paying HECS, but I couldn't guarantee her or that she wouldn't have. So we were chatting about the possibilities of not being saddled with a monster debt.
Yeah,
That's great. Yeah.
No, that's
Look, we're getting. Oh, we've got Jason. I think we might wrap it up then because we're after 9 o'clock. But Jason, you've got a thought.
Oh, look, just quickly with a bit of good news, there is talk at Federation University about teaching history and about arts continuing. I believe there's even the possibility of a bachelor in history or something on that line.
Oh,
so there is some discussion of that, but I don't know where that's at.
I actually did my
they were left with
PhD
one
in
member.
history.
They're left with one member of staff, and he was travelling from Ballarat to Churchill, doing a round trip to be teaching, which is a very long drive, really.
Yeah, it is.
Better on a train.
All right. Look, thank you very much for those who've stayed the long course, and I hope you found it useful.